Someone asked the question about attending a communal penitential service and whether there is forgiveness of sins as one attends that penitential service without going to a priest, which happens within the midst of the service or at the end of the service, to confess one's sins and to receive sacramental absolution. Are you still forgiven of your sins? Well, first of all, if we look at the whole history of the church, forgiveness of sins, and daily sins especially, those sins that are venial sins in our lives, are forgiven in many different ways, by praying the Our Father, by doing works of charity, by the penitential part right at the very beginning of Mass, through various penances that a person would undertake. All of those are ways of forgiveness of daily sins. And so a penitential service that's attended, where a person asks for God's forgiveness for their daily sins, then those are forgiven in that way. Sacramental penance, sacramental confession, really comes out of that history of a means of forgiveness of those very grave sins in one's life. And so, for the most part, when people would gravely sin in the very early church, everyone knew that. And so a person would come before the bishop or eventually the priest, and in front of the whole community, and they would take on a penance that they would do sometimes for years, and then they would be reconciled in the midst of the whole community through a laying on of hands. Therefore, there was a confession, there was penitential works, there was a outward sign of the laying on of hands or absolution, and there was a visible sign of contrition on the part of the person. And those four movements are a part of the sacramental act of forgiveness of sins. And so contrition is involved, accepting a penance is involved, a confession of one's sinfulness is involved, and then also the absolution by the priest. That's what we recognize as sacramental forgiveness of sins. Now, the church encourages people with venial sins to also celebrate it sacramentally, but it is not necessarily like it is if a person has gravely sinned, because that grave sin is not only an offense against God, but it also misrepresents the whole church community. Now, of course, we could go back to the practice of coming before the whole community and expressing our grave sinfulness, but we're a little bit more private now, and not everybody knows what our grave sinfulness might be. The priest represents both Christ's forgiveness, but also the reconciliation with the church community. And therefore, it becomes necessary to confess one's sins before a priest who is representing the whole community as a symbol of Christ's presence in the forgiveness of sins. And so that if a person is aware of grave sin in their life, of mortal sin, then they need, in a penitential service, to celebrate that sacrament of penance by confessing their sins, by showing contrition, by accepting a penance, and by receiving the absolution of Christ that is shown through the sign involved in the sacraments and through the sign of the priest.